Welcome everyone. This is the Lynn Beazley AO Turn Ecosystem Observations webinar series. It's great to have you all tuned in. And to start today, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we at Turn acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians throughout Australia, New Zealand and all nations. We honour their profound connections to the land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay our respects to the elders past and present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within our community. Again, thank you all for joining us today. For those that haven't met me, my name is Beryl Morris and I'm the Director of TURN, Australia's Land Ecosystem Observatory. Now, during this webinar, feel free to ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them towards the end of the webinar. If you have any technical issues, if you can put comments into the chat function, we'll try to resolve those as soon as we can. And also you can use the chat function to be able to contact any of the other attendees, of which we've got some 200 from all parts of the globe. So thank you very much for joining us. So in TURN, our Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, we're an NCRES funded project, and our work is a collaboration between many universities and other institutions across Australia and the entire community of people who are involved in environmental science. So today we've got 3 speakers, and we're going to be talking about resilience in Australia's ecosystems. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Ian Cresswell, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the meaning of resilience and what we know about the multiple factors that interact to determine resilience capacity. So Ian is the chair of the Resilient Landscapes Hub of the National Environmental Science Program, otherwise known as NESP, and he's a former TURN Advisory Board member. Thanks, Ian. And currently an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales. He's also chair of the National State of Environment 2021 project, chair of the Western Australian Biodiversity Science Institute, where he's currently going to be talking from, a member of the board of the Western Australian Marine Science Institute, and many other things. And he has an extensive experience working in environmental science and biodiversity conservation and discovery, and in oceans governance, fisheries management, wildlife regulation and protected areas, formerly in CSIRO. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Anna Richards, who's going to be telling us about whether it's possible to develop a framework for assessing ecosystem resilience. So Anna is a research scientist in the ecosystem dynamics team based at CSIRO Tropical Ecosystems Research Centre in Darwin in the Northern Territory. She's also a co-author of the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework, which seeks to use available scientific knowledge about ecosystem dynamics and a set of ecosystem models to describe the dynamic characteristics and drivers of Australian ecosystems in unmodified and modified states. And one use of such models is to help our understanding of ecosystem dynamics over time, including ecosystem responses to climate change. And Professor Lindsay Hutley is going to tell us a little bit more about what we can learn about ecosystem resilience from long-term monitoring, stories from running the North Australian Tropical Transect NATT gradient, which extends 100 kilometres or more south of Darwin. And Lindsay's a long-term TURN member, working at Charles Darwin University, focused on quantifying fluxes of carbon, water and energy balance from a range of ecosystems, including mangroves and eucalypt-dominated tropics, tropical savanna ecosystems of Northern Australia. Lindsay's work across plant ecology, ecophysiology, ecohydrology, land atmosphere exchange and soil science provides an essential understanding of the dynamics of ecosystems. So I'm going to ask Ian Cresswell to now start talking, and Ian will hand over to Anna when he's finished talking, and then Anna will hand over to Lindsay, and then we'll hand over to you as an audience and ask you to share some of your questions with us. So on we go.
Thanks, Beryl. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Noongar Nation and the land on which I sit today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So my job today is to introduce to you the topic of resilience in Australia's ecosystems. I suppose where I wanted to start was why is it important? And I'd give you a quote from David Attenborough, which is, "We are facing a global crisis. We're totally dependent upon the natural world. It supplies us with every oxygen-laden breath we take and every mouthful of food we eat. But we are currently damaging it so profoundly that many of its natural systems are now on the verge of breakdown." So that's pretty strong words. And so understanding the resilience of our natural systems, that's the capacity of that system to recover from perturbations, is critical. But what we mean by resilience really depends on the system we're looking at. So at the most basic level, like an individual, your resilience is your ability to withstand change. If you take it up a level to that group of individuals that are a population, we look at the resilience of that population to withstand changes, and then multiple populations of species interacting in an ecosystem. And that group of interacting species is the biodiversity of the ecosystem. That's key to the governing of the processes that govern that ecosystem. And an ecosystem's resilience to disturbance is probably less about some big list of the plants and animals and microorganisms that live there, but more about the particular functions that those species play in maintaining that overall system. So in terms of survival of the species, the resilience of the individual is less than that of the population, and in turn that's less than that of the entire ecosystem, where a group of species all work together or against each other to exploit the resources that exist there. So you can think of an ecosystems as being more resilient than their component species, and that they're able to adapt to environmental changes than individuals. But we have so many more pressures on ecosystems now than ever before. I'll give you an example. A grassland can have many different pressures on it over a course of time, and different species in the mix will be more dominant or less dominant at different times. If you want to take an even broader view, you consider life at the level of the whole planet. So in geological time frame, you can argue that life has even higher degree of adaptation and resilience. So if you think of the end of the Permian-Triassic extinction event caused by huge volcanoes in Siberia, that killed 81% of marine species on the planet, 70% of the terrestrial vertebrate species, and one estimate is up to 95% of all life died. But slowly, over millions of years, life bounced back. Different from before? Absolutely. But life on Earth has showed resilience through at least 5 major extinction events. But what we're interested today really is about the idea of resilience of ecosystems and Australia's ecosystems. Those natural systems like forests or grasslands or whatever system that is of your interest or perhaps where you live. So I'm sitting here in Perth, and now where I am used to be Banksia woodland a couple of hundred years ago. Many of the different pressures have reduced the extent and condition of Banksia woodland. And today, Banksia woodland is considered a threatened ecological community and is listed as endangered. But up until colonial times, those Banksia woodland ecosystems were resilient to the many perturbations that existed in the natural world and from the humans who lived here. But as the recent colonial development has spread over this bit of the coastal plain, that ecosystem's been cleared, degraded, split up into lots of tiny fragments, and all these new threats from weeds and animals that it's never encountered before have reduced its resilience. So right here, just near here, is a large patch retained right in the middle of Perth called Kings Park. It wasn't cleared, but it's continued to degrade over the past 190 years from that range of different stresses that are attacking it every day. That once resilient ecosystem that's been here for hundreds of thousands of years, it's no longer resilient to the modern threats or perturbations that now exist. And management has to do a whole lot of things just to try and keep it to survive. It's now very difficult to find a patch of intact Banksia woodland like my mother used to walk through from Nedlands to Claremont, picking donkey orchids on the way to give to her grandmother. That's not even 100 years ago. So you can see that the pace of change on our ecosystems is immense. Obviously, if you happen to be an ecosystem right in the middle of a city, it's harder to be resilient against the huge number of pressures. Pretty hard to be resilient against a bulldozer. But for those uncleared benches in Perth, it's been that interaction of pressures, the cumulative impact from grazing, pests, changes to burning regimes, changes to the soil, changes to the soil biota, and the constant people pressure that's led to a dramatic decline in the species richness and abundance in that ecosystem. So understanding how and why systems are resilient, and indeed trying to uncover how to measure that resilience, is a major field in ecological science. The concept of resilience in ecosystems was first introduced in the 1970s by a scientist called Buzz Holling, and he was using it to describe the persistence of natural systems in the face of changes, be they natural changes or human changes, which we call anthropogenic changes, causes. And he described resilience in two ways. As the time required for an ecosystem to return back to equilibrium or steady state, or stability, some authors call it. And the other one was the capacity of the system to absorb those disturbances and reorganize while undergoing change. So still to essentially maintain that same function, that structure and identity. So when I was talking about grasslands, you might have one species that's very dominant. It absorbs different changes, grazing, fire, and another set of grasses becomes dominant. But the actual function of the grassland stays the same. But when you move from one stable system to another, that's called a regime shift. We've seen in Australia grasslands through different pressures turn into shrublands, and that's called a regime shift. So how long it takes for that regime shift to happen can vary enormously, and it depends on the ecosystem that you're looking at. It could take decades or centuries for a forest ecosystem to slowly change into a different system, or it could be really quick through some catastrophe. But to date, generally, scientists haven't been that successful in identifying exactly where the tipping point is until after it's happened. So one of the issues for science is to actually be able to understand the resilience of the system and then to start to predict what it is we need to do to stop that from tipping over. The need to be able to measure resilience and then manage for it is a key focus for research into the future. The characteristics of each ecosystem are different, and that's what governs resilience. So if I take another example, an overexploited rocky intertidal zone, reef, that can recover quite quickly within years to a decade once the pressures are removed. Whereas old growth forests, in an old growth forest, the trees there and the system and the animals and the plants, they might require hundreds of years to recover fully. But the balance of nature isn't all about just being some stable, what we call a climax community of old growth trees. That's not quite right. And indeed, Aboriginal land management knew that very well. Being static in a system is not about, actually can mean you're less resilient because you have less variation and less ability to adapt. For healthy ecological communities, resilience can come from having different parts at different stages. So they're able to cope with all different sorts of shocks and disturbances that might otherwise lead to a regime shift. And you see Aboriginal land management and burning, you see a mosaic of different types of parts of that ecosystem at different stages in their life. I mentioned earlier that biodiversity controls ecosystems and the ecosystem function and hence resilience. And biodiversity loss is a major issue in Australia and all over the planet. As species are lost, you then start to lose some of the functions in that ecosystem, and that can reduce the ability of the system to withstand shocks. Another different example in Australia is from, say, semi-arid and arid Australia, changes to the ecological processes arising from damage to the biological soil crusts that exist. So biological soil crusts are extensive carpets of lichens, bryophytes, cyanobacteria, and they are primary producers at the very base of the whole food web. And they play a major function on which all the other organisms depend all the way up through the food chain. Disrupting that function disrupts the whole ecosystem and makes it far less resilient and therefore far easier to change. And we've seen losses of biological soil crusts in Australia from grazing animals, hardwood grazing animals, which then weakens the ecosystem and leads it to change. So the impact of biodiversity loss on ecological process can be very significant, and just as significant as some of the other major global drivers that perhaps we all hear about more daily, like the rising carbon concentration in the atmosphere, or nitrogen overload in systems when you think of river systems that have become heavily polluted, or fires. So fires is a big one all around the planet and here in Australia. So there's some of the things that actually affect ecosystems. So are Australian ecosystems resilient? And if I think of the example of fires, a few months ago I visited the south coast of New South Wales, and you'll remember there was devastating bushfires there 15 months earlier. And after those intense hot fires, you can see amazing recovery in those eucalypt species that are adapted to fire, but not all of the components. Some species require specific habitats that just aren't available in a post-fire regime, and or they just are not tolerant to fire, and they can't deal with the burning or clearing. And that's what's happened in Tasmania. So in 2016, we had terrible fires, wild, out of control fires from lightning, which burnt 126,000 hectares of Tasmania, including 20,000 hectares within the World Heritage Area. Some of those ecosystems are resilient to fire, but their recovery can be very slow due to the harsh alpine environment that they're in. This is alpine, subalpine plants and animals, but some are just not resilient to fires. And the University of Tasmania and the Tasmanian Park Service are doing a whole lot of study post that fire. And that showed a large mortality of some of those species like pencil pines, which can be hundreds of thousands of years old. And we've seen 70% mortality with little resprouting and few seedlings coming through. So that might take centuries for those sorts of systems to come back, if they ever do. And that's the work that park services and universities are busy working on to understand that. One good thing though is that 3 months after that, after the post-fire, camera trapping shows that a lot of mammal species are back, and both in the burnt and the unburnt areas, with the exception of some small mammals which were absent. So that's something we have to look at in terms of the burnt areas. So the 4 big pressures on Australia's environment which impact on ecosystem resilience are climate change, land use change, habitat fragmentation and degradation, and invasive species. But the biggest concern is the cumulative pressure from the combination of all of those. And I'm very pleased to say that the federal government, through the National Environmental Science Program, has just funded a new hub, Resilient Landscapes Hub. We're going to be looking at those as well as many of the other researchers who continue to look at that all around Australia. But my time's up, so I need to introduce Anna Richards. And Anna is a senior research scientist and a colleague of mine at CSIRO, and she's going to try and show us how you can develop a framework for assessing ecosystem resilience. Certainly hope she is. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ian. I hope everyone can see my screen. I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And today, as Ian mentioned, and thanks for that great introduction, I'm going to answer or hope to sort of discuss the question, is it possible to develop a framework for assessing ecosystem resilience? And in this talk, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors that are listed there at the bottom. I wanted to show this picture because I had the privilege just over the weekend of bushwalking in northern Kakadu National Park in Sandstone Heath country. This is right up from the top of Australia near Darwin in the Northern Territory. And we passed through a bit of country that had been burnt, probably by a lightning ignited hot fire late last year. And you can see a lot of dead trees in this photograph, as well as black soil and rock. And I wanted to show this picture as an example of the types of changes we observe in our landscapes and ecosystems. And some of the questions that I had walking through this landscape include, will the trees come back to this system? What does this mean for the animals that need large trees as habitat? What new suite of animals might use this system now that the spinifex is young and there are many flowering forbs? And how do the changes wrought by that hot fire impact the ability of this landscape to provide food and shelter to fauna, or store carbon, prevent future hot fires, or how much they change sediment runoff and water quality in the catchment? So our ecosystems change all the time, but how do we understand when that change matters in terms of a shift in the resilience of an ecosystem and its capacity to support biodiversity or provide ecosystem services? So you can see a set of images on this slide, and each set of images shows a type of ecosystem under different stages of recovery from disturbances such as fire and drought. However, the photos on the right-hand side show those systems where there's been a significant transformation and a different cycle of disturbance and recovery may be observed. For example, at the top there, you can see a fire-killed mallee modified state that results from the introduction of frequent and intense fires into mallee ecosystems. It leads to a new ecosystem or a novel state with no eucalypt species. And the next row down, you can see the application of fertiliser and sowing of improved pastures shifts boxgum grassy woodlands from a system which retains ground cover during drought to one that doesn't. While we can observe many changes from the ground, we're increasingly gaining insights into large and frequent change at landscape scales from Earth observation and data streams. However, the key question is how can we attribute change in those data sets to ecologically meaningful insights, including where there is a shift in the state of the system, and how do we account for properties such as inertia, hysteresis, and multiple stable states in our ecosystems. So I'm just showing an example here from Gunbower Koondrop Perikuta Forest Icon site, which is located on the Murray River. It's a large river red gum forest. And you'll see that the map is showing changes in woody cover, which is the darker green colour. And you can see substantial changes in cover between 2010 and 2015. So state and transition models are one such tool that allow us to conceptualise ecosystems as a set of states linked by transitions. And they were first put forward in 1989 by Westerby, Walker and Neumayer. And they often look like a series of boxes and arrows. You can sort of see the slightly fuzzy apologies on the right-hand side. And these show states, which are relatively stable, recognisable assemblages of species occupying a site. And these states are linked or separated by thresholds or boundaries, which when crossed, which is termed a transition, this is not reversible on a practical timescale without the input of energy, which usually implies management. And state and transition models allow us to communicate complex ecosystem behaviour and set up a series of hypotheses about ecological change that can be tested. And they can be conceptual right through to spatially explicit and quantifiable. Here is a diagram of what we call a dynamic state and transition model that shows each state made up of multiple expressions. And these expressions capture changes in the structure of the vegetation or species present that are a result of disturbance events and biomass recovery processes. And these disturbances are called endogenous disturbances. And the expressions within states denote changes that we expect to see in ecosystems that do not indicate a change in state. In other words, these are the characteristics of a resilient ecosystem. When new disturbances are introduced or endogenous disturbance regimes are modified, then a threshold can be reached and ecosystems might transition to a new state. And this state also has a number of expressions. And the reference state in state and transition models denotes our best understanding of disturbance and recovery dynamics to which ecosystems have adapted over evolutionary timescales. And these reference ecosystem states provide habitat for the persistence of all biodiversity associated with that ecosystem. It is likely in many cases that the reference state is no longer observed in present-day landscapes and may only be understood from historical information. The information contained in the reference state helps us to understand current ecosystem dynamics or changes, as these will mimic those in the reference. And you can see the reference there and the modified states and the expressions. So one key question that comes from these models is, can we define the types of changes that are observed in ecosystems in their reference state for the Australian continent, as this might be very useful for managing our ecosystems and their resilience. So in the last couple of years, we've put together something called the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework, and this is a synthesis of knowledge on the dynamics of major Australian ecosystems It's come from expert elicitation and literature searching. And the framework has two types of models. One type is called archetype models, which are conceptual, and they describe the reference dynamics and ecosystem characteristics to which Australian ecosystems have adapted. And these reference dynamics provide the backdrop to how ecosystems respond to more recent and transformative disturbance processes. Archetype models serve as general templates for ecosystem types identified in an area of interest. So they're conceptual, but they can be brought down into a quantifiable model. And there are 46 archetype models in the framework that describe all ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, down to the intertidal zone across the Australian continent. And these models group ecosystems with similar disturbance and recovery dynamics. So there's groups of fire-disturbed or drought-disturbed ecosystems, and drought and fire-disturbed ecosystems. They are conceptual models, but they include disturbances that might be driven by people, as well as disturbances that are driven by climate. The finer levels of the models within the framework are state and transition models, like the box and arrow diagram I showed before. And we're starting to publish these archetype models in a set of booklets. There are 14 booklets in total, and you can find more information at the website listed below. I'm just going to give you some more detail in the next few slides. So this is an example of a booklet that groups models that can be thought broadly as describing eucalypt woodland ecosystems. And we have 5 models in this booklet. That is 5 distinct disturbance and recovery dynamics of eucalypt woodlands across Australia. The first model I'm going to describe today, or the example I'm going to give, is obligate cedar woodlands. And this is a fairly simple model, or a diagram of the ecosystem dynamic model, showing changes in obligate cedar eucalypt woodlands from regrowth woodland to sapling stands to mature stands. And the timeframes listed in this model are for obligate cedar eucalypt woodland in a rainfall range of between 270 to 330 millimetres annual rainfall. But what can we use this understanding of dynamic ecosystems and ecosystem states and transitions for? So I'm going to give 2 examples to finish off the talk. The first one is from wet dry tropical eucalypt woodlands, or otherwise known as savannas. And this is the archetype model for this ecosystem type. And here, instead of photographs like the obligate cedar woodland, I'm showing boxes and arrows with text. And this is our best expert opinion of how savanna woodland responds to disturbance in its reference state. We can add climate projections and combine this with the archetype model to provide a hypothesis of how the types of changes that we may observe under climate change, and how this might impact biodiversity, carbon storage, and other aspects of the ecosystems that we may value, in this case in savannas. And so with these climate projections for the top end of Australia, we might expect to lose some of those expressions or some of those changes we now see, where we see a shift to a long unburnt savanna ecosystem or monsoon vine thicket. The last example I wanted to talk about was state and transition simulation models, which were developed by Apex RMS. And this is a piece of software that allows you to spatially model changes in ecosystem states at landscape scales. So it takes that information contained in state and transition models, including the drivers of transitions between states, and allows you to predict the extent of ecosystem states by simulating probability of different transitions, and by extension, the resilience of the landscape under different scenarios. So some scenarios that you can test include perhaps a hotter and drier climate in the future, or more frequent fire, or the presence of invasive species. And quickly, here is one example from the Gunbow Koondrook Perracuda Forest Icon site that I mentioned previously. This sits on the Murray River in north central Victoria. A state and transition model is being developed for this area. I don't want you to read the details, that's why I've made it small, but I just wanted to show you an example of a real world location. And what we did is we used that state and transition model to generate a map of ecosystem states and expressions in 2015. And then the state and transition simulation model, STSIM, was used to predict changes in the distribution of states to 2025 based on probabilities of transitions under a new management regime of forest harvesting and grazing. And over this 10-year period, there was a predicted decline in the extent of wetland states, which are shown in blue. And this example shows the utility of how you can use that state and transition model framing for understanding ecological resilience of ecosystems and landscapes. by systematically understanding observed changes in ecosystem characteristics, and then using this to develop future scenarios under altered climate and management. And lastly, I wanted to acknowledge the experts that provided input into that state and transition model for the Gumbau Koondruk Paracuda case study. They're listed here on the slide. And thank you, that's it from me. I now get to pass over to Dr. Lindsay Hutley from Charles Darwin University.
Thank you, Anna. I hope you can all see my slides. Thank you very much, and hello everyone. And I see a large number of welcomes from country. So I too, like Anna, are sitting in Darwin on Larrakia country and the saltwater people. So yeah, pay my respects to them. So today I was given a bit of a brief from Beryl, a director of Turn, to have a bit of a talk about what's happening in North Australia, but with a bit of an eye on this concept of resilience and what we've been doing in terms of resilience and long-term monitoring, and tell a few stories. So here I am going to tell a few stories. You'll see on there I've listed two other colleagues, close colleagues, who are so intimate and completely linked into this program in North Australia. There's Jason Berenger, who's a long-term colleague from University of Western Australia, and prior to that Monash University, and Matthew Northwood, who's an employee here who looks after a lot of the field programs we're going to spin through today. And Melbourne University colleagues have also been a really important contributor to the work we're about to look at. And of course the glue holding much of it together, certainly the last 10 years, is the Turn network. So let's have a little go. So I'm sitting in North Australia. Many of you, if not all of you, except for Anna and myself, and maybe a few others, are sitting in Southern Australia. And in terms of the thinking of resilience, we are now seeing, as Ian beautifully laid out with no slides, someone commented on, isn't it lovely to see a slide-free talk? It's a lovely unpacking of this concept of resilience and why we need to worry about it. So climate change is here. It's now, certainly from my perspective, sitting in North Australia, I'm watching heat waves, floods, fires, followed by more floods, then drought. And now I see we have mouse plagues. It's a bit of petulance thrown in there to get a bit biblical. North Australia, perhaps a different scenario, a little more stable perhaps. The NT and the Kimberley region of northwest Western Australia is a largely intact landscape relative to Southern Australia, certainly, given we've got a population of about 2 suburbs of Melbourne spread over about 2 million square kilometres, so which makes it a wonderful place to live, of course. But we too have environmental issues, we have land use change, we have even some interest in intensification of land use change, intensification of cropping, and more recently some interest in fracking. And of course, for 100 years, we've had a grazing industry operating in the Savannah rangelands of North Australia. So we also have, as Ian mentioned, a range of environmental issues, weeds, invasive animals, shifts in fire regimes, and feral animal impacts, et cetera, et cetera. And the other issue, I guess, is, well, are we seeing climate change impacts in the north? And if so, how might they manifest themselves? So today I thought we'd spin through that. There's a few photos there of some impacts. You know, we are not necessarily as pristine as one might think. So how to look at this? Perhaps a starting point might be the framework provided by this quite nice website of climate change in Australia, and the pucey looking coloured box is what we might look at today. This is the monsoon, the Western monsoon sub-region of the climate change predictor, and this website provides some idea of what may or may not be happening in all regions, effectively NRM regions of Australia. And on the right-hand side, we can see what does the CSIRO-BOM modelling suggests? Well, it's all fairly vague when we're operating at this sort of scale, but average temperatures are obviously going to increase, very high confidence. I've highlighted the sort of issues of which we have very high confidence. More hot days, warm spells projected with very high confidence. No one's quite sure what rainfall is going to be doing. The observations of rainfall in North Australia suggest a weak wetting trend that's been happening for some time. But intensification of rainfall events, big, wet, big, dry. Perhaps are we seeing that? And this was an interesting one that's relevant to the talk for today. Is mean sea level rise will continue. The sea level rise across the North Australian coast is much higher than what it is down south, about double, and if not triple in a few spots, around 6 to 7 millimetres per year. So sea level rise is important, but also these extreme sea level events, as we're about to see. That is potentially a very important process to look at coastal ecosystems as well as terrestrial. So I thought we'd look at some coastal systems as well as terrestrial systems today. Certainly anecdotally, I have experienced personally, I think climate is changing in the north and west now, starting to see that manifest potentially. And an obvious one to start with is the mangrove dieback event that many of you may or may not have heard of. Where we had a widespread mangrove dieback event in the Gulf of Carpentaria, North Australia, and that's what a dying mangrove looks like. This is in Queensland, Currumbin, Gulf of Carpentaria. This is September 2017. The mangroves started to die or fail about late 2016, and of course the obvious question, what causes this? This is a coastline with very little infrastructure. There's no obvious infrastructure that would drive this, or a pollution event, probably not a disease event. Is it climate change? This is what that stand looks like up close. This is not a pretty sight. These trees are all Avicennias, and a year before this photo, 2 years before this photo, this would have been a green mangrove forest, a functioning forest. So think back to Anna's state and transition modelling. This is a very rapid transition. This has occurred within about a year of the onset. And of course, a site like that, you can readily look and watch this change using remote sensing technology. That's a pretty stark signal to noise ratio. So these stands are readily examined, or the temporal change in cover is obvious using a remote sensing platform, very important. And this is what this system looks like from the air. This is from the Limon-Cox River in the NT, and the Indigenous communities along this luminous stretch of the coast were the first to notify people that something very, very strange is happening in their country. They know the country better than anyone on the planet, and they notified Parks and Wildlife, who then notified various land management agencies. Something enormous was happening, and sure enough, when we got on the satellite, this unfolding event was there for all to see. That's what this stretch of coast normally looks like, and this is what it looked like probably early 16. So there's quite a bit of literature now out there about the descriptions of what actually happened. Norm Duke from James Cook has led that analysis. He spent countless hours in helicopters and on the ground tracking and monitoring this ecosystem. So we're seeing a transition. What do we think caused this? To cut a very long story short, it looks like the 2015-16 ENSO was a very severe ENSO event in North Australia, and it was associated with a significant sea level drop. We have a very flat landscape. So this sea level drop effectively meant at various sites along the coast, we could track the tidal dynamics. And we did some analysis based on LiDAR missions that Tern supported, where we can determine a very accurate environmental elevation model along this entire coastline. We can go and have a look at sites where we know the dieback's been severe and just work out with some precision what height range is being impacted by the dieback. Where is the dieback distributed, and how does that link to tidal dynamics? So this figure below is a relatively complicated figure, but the take-home message is it's a map of how significant are the natural tidal cycles at a particular site on the coastline. And this is for the year 2010, a fairly wet year or average year, and you can see at various heights above the ground where mangroves occur. At 0.6 metres above AHD, that's our Australian height datum, our reference point, we can see a pretty good distribution of tidal mixing throughout an entire year. This is from February right through to the end of 2011. So that's pretty much spanning year. In the ENSO event, this is the actual event, that tidal mixing collapsed. So we really think this very sudden rapid drop in sea level had a catastrophic effect on the ability of those mangroves to experience normal conditions to which they're evolved. So that has probably resulted in rather elevated temperatures were also associated with the event, as well as below average rainfall. And all of that means we have a lethal cocktail salinized hot mud, basically, which killed these organisms. There's several good papers out that help describe the biogeochemistry of what possibly happened in the mud in the cores. That's been led by Southern Cross University. They've done some fantastic work there. So they've got a pretty good idea what's killed these mangroves now, but the trigger was climate change. And the consequence is a very unstable coastline with impacts on fisheries, mud crabs. Indigenous people use this coastline for their livelihoods. And so are we seeing a lessening of resilience? Mangroves are a pretty tough plant species. To knock them off over 1,000 kilometres synchronously, in other words, all at once, was quite a unique event. And we need to know about the return period of these conditions. What were the climatic conditions that led to this catastrophic ecosystem failure, this transition that Anna was talking about? So that is a North Australian climate event on our coastlines that's happening and still happening as we speak. Terrestrial systems. So the dominant ecosystem across the north is the savanna rangeland systems. We might now go and have a look at what might be happening there. And in general, since I've been here, I've been wandering around the savannas, as has Anna, for decades, and they're pretty resilient. They're pretty stable. They have a remarkable ability to bounce back from the frequent fire that we see in this landscape. This Facebook page really caught my notice in November 2020 from Future Beef. This is the NT Gov's Department of Primary Industries research station, smack in the middle of the Victoria River District, a sort of semi-arid savanna system, around 700 millimetres rainfall, and their staff, local communities, started to notice widespread tree death across this part of the northern half of the NT. And I thought, goodness gracious, not more tree death in the territory. But that's what they were seeing. These people know their country very well. I was also struck by this comment from someone. Sounds like too many trees competing against too many trees in a stressed environment. Talk to the old timers who will probably advise the overzealous, that's probably the likes of myself, that nature knows how to sort it out. So that I thought was a pretty shrewd comment. That perhaps suggests we have some sort of disequilibrium has occurred that's killed these trees. Or is it simply the severity of heat waves and drought, which I'm now about to show you, has driven this process, i.e. this tree death? Well, not according to some. This book is a terrific old book from a guy called Darrell Lewis, published in 2002. This guy took historic photographs across this very district and simply compared contemporary shots, even if it was 20 years ago, and could clearly demonstrate there's been quite a significant change in the landscape since Indigenous people were probably moved off country, and these landscapes were managed for grazing. These are pretty good grazing environments. So has the fire regime changed, which has then engineered a thickening or an increase in woody cover. And as a result, there's simply not enough moisture once we have a stressful or a low rainfall event to sustain this ecosystem. This is a site south of there, but still a site that we know well. We took a little time-lapse video when we went to service our site. We could not believe our eyes. This is a Mitchell grassland. This is it should be a green environment. This was shot in about March 2019. That normally looks like that. So when we got to the site, we saw nothing of the sort. We saw something that looked a bit like Mars. So again, we are seeing change. We are seeing manifest change in the ecosystem's productivity. Sure enough, if we jump into a model where we can see, well, what on earth's going on out there? This is the Australian Landscape Water Balance Model developed by CSIRO in collaboration with the Bureau of Meteorology. Here I've plotted the north in this year, 2019. We're displaying the root zone moisture contents, and this is the relative, this is an anomaly plot, basically. This is relative to 100 years of estimating root zone water content based on models, based on climate, rainfall, vegetation, and assumed water use of that vegetation. Now, the model might be wrong, but what the model probably does tell us that the relative anomaly is possibly manifesting itself. So we really are seeing a very widespread stress. The other thing that struck me about 2019, 2000, simply sitting around at home, how hot it was. This is amazing. Our temperature, our maximal temperatures are pretty constant in Darwin, around 32 to 34. I said, what is going on? I grabbed the bomb data, and sure enough, we had a period from August right through the dry season until the monsoon finally struck of really elevated temperatures of the like I've not experienced before. 44 days above 35, I suspect that's conservative. So we've got drought and we've got heat in unprecedented scenario. And we also had 2 back-to-back monsoon failures. If we flip back to that video, that video was, our Facebook page from the NT government. That's probably shot around this year. What I've done here is taken an online product, National Maps, and looked at the cover. Here's the total vegetation cover anomaly. Again, we're looking at anomalies. This is from the year 2011, so a year that we know is pretty wet. And this is the sort of scenario we've actually got. Again, the cover is pretty healthy. It's above the average anomaly. What did we see though if we then take exactly the same patch of the environment in October 2020, matching up with when we saw these widespread savanna dieback reports? And sure enough, the place looks a massive reduction in the tree cover. I suspect an underestimate. This is the scale up the top here. You can see that's only going back 25%. It's probably even worse than that. This is the part of the landscape where we're looking at here, and you can see this anomaly. If I expand up this mapping product to look at cover loss, it's really quite extensive and probably matches up quite nicely with that water balance. So we clearly see the system has run out of water, and I've never seen anything like that before in the north in my 25 years of time. Let's return to this notion that we've got some thickening, and perhaps this is a very shrewd observation by this person. Here we have fractional green cover plotted since the late 89. This is when usable remote sensing was available for us. This is a Landsat composite every quarter, pulled together by a really nice little website Queensland government developed called the Veg Machine. Grab yourself a polygon and it'll spit out what the cover has been doing over a long period of time. And sure enough, we've got a very distinct, statistically significant trend in thickening. The site's around 840 millimeters, pretty much representative of that sort of not really semi-arid, but savanna that's well used. This is on a cattle station, classic thickening response. And we've been visiting this site since around 2008, and that I have photographs of the site. And sure enough, that is a very accurate reflection of what's happening. So we seem to have some sort of disequilibrium. We're getting more and more straws in the bucket, more trees. If we take a broader brush and we look at some sites, this is along, again, a territory rainfall gradient from dry environments, the bottom of the Savannah Estate up to the very top of the Savannah Estate, around 2,000 millimetres rainfall. I've plotted here the basal area. These are NATT sites, North Australian Tropical Transect. We'll touch more on that in a minute. So these are basically, as you increase the system, you see a very tight coupling between the sort of the stand basal area that can be supported in any given rainfall. As well, this is the leaf area index. This is the amount of leaf material. How green is the canopy? How much leaf is out there? Same relationship. And even the number of stems per hectare, rather crude measure, but even that correlated. So in other words, it's telling us the number of straws in the ground extracting water is very coupled to the environment, to rainfall. So perhaps it's not surprisingly, if we have a massive change in rainfall, we will see a correction. This is a slightly more complicated plot. This is a good example of turn in action, where we've got a PhD student visited every single turn site in the country and assessed the hydraulic features, if you like, of all the tree species. And of course, we had several sites in this experiment where the student basically undertook, this is Jennifer Peters' paper just published, where she looked at the hydraulic performance of trees at each site across a huge environmental gradient that the turn sites represent. These are the super sites. And interestingly, there's Litchfield. So that's high rainfall. This is Litchfield National Park. This is high rainfall savanna. And its numbers fall out on exactly the same sort of position of this figure as of rainforest of the Daintree. So here we have what's Turgor loss point is the water potential, or how wet the tissue is when we lose Turgor, or we start to really feel water stress kicking in. And those here it's plotted against the leaf water potential. It's a really good map or an estimate of hydraulic vulnerability. And here's some mulga in the Central Australian desert, very much lower. It's capable of withstanding a much drier environment. Well, I was quite shocked at how close our savannas sat with, relative to tropical rainforest trees. So these trees are, of course, in an environment that need to be able to get through a 6-month dry season. So there's a potential vulnerability that our trees may have, and is that what we're now seeing? So there is another study done by a Melbourne University colleague of ours, Stefan Arndt. He did the same sort of thing, but at a drier site, a little closer to the area where we saw tree dieback. And he said something quite interesting in his assessment based on the physiological properties of the way water moved through our savanna eucalypts. They are at risk of hydraulic failure if the system is rapidly drying out. So that was quite a telling piece of evidence. So the evidence suggests physiologically, while these trees are beautifully adapted to a particular rainfall, shift that rainfall, thicken the vegetation, we may be engineering some instability in the ecosystem. So how on earth are we going to work out all of these factors? We've got CO2 increasing, we've got perhaps rainfall variance going up, we've got certainly increasing temperature, we've got to deal with fire. Fire is an intimate part of the landscape of North Australia. I haven't really mentioned fire. We do our conference on fire, of course. How's land use changing? How's it altering our savanna rangelands? How would we go about this? Well, we need some ingredients to do this. How about I would suggest you need a long-term flux tower network. A flux tower is a site where we can directly measure the energy balance of a site, a vegetation patch, it could be a grassland or a forest. We can measure how much CO2 is coming in and out of that system and how much water is being used by that system. It measures all the water use, all the photosynthetic performance of all components of the ecosystem in one hit. And if I was going to do that, we'd need at least 15 years to ensure our observed trends or any sort of systematic analysis we might do is over and above the interannual variability. We'd also need some satellites, and we'd also need some really good modelling to engineer this sort of approach. And sure enough, that is exactly what Jason Barringer and us put together in 2011. We had a major research effort to engineer these monitoring stations, flux towers, right across the north, or at least the sort of monsoon tropics of the NT, funded by the ARC, and now in the last 10 years, TURN, a collaboration of universities and CSIRO. And that has been a sort of a defining program that is still ongoing to this day. So we've been going 20 years. Some of this work started at this Howard Springs long-term study. This was a study where we were looking at groundwater usage by these savanna tree species. And you can see today, here we have this NATT. NATT stands for North Australian Tropical Transect. It was a transect established by CSIRO in the mid-2000s as a sort of a framework to make observations systematically of vegetation performance, structure, biodiversity, all sorts of things, because we have this remarkable temperature and more specifically a gradient of rainfall from the coastal region around Darwin into the arid zone. So it's almost like a living laboratory that we can then go and try and understand how systems work, and then what will happen if our drivers, land use change, fire, climate, all start to move about. I'm going to put a fairly narcissistic couple of slides up here, i.e. a photo of myself, but this is us in 1997. That's last century. This is me. This is my good colleague, Tony O'Grady, who was a PhD student in those days. We started from humble beginnings. So this is an early work where we're simply running campaigns to work out what is the water use of this savanna bush. In the mid-90s, it wasn't really very well known. And so we thought we'd build this little sign as a bit of a laugh. We had a bit of time in our hands at times. So that work has continued. And here's me again, being a narcissist. There I am again, about X years later. We found the sign in the bush, and that's the exact patch of bush. And you can see I've got a bit fatter, and so have the trees. So we are seeing change in this landscape. So this is the Howard Springs site. As I say, it's been going since the 90s. Monash University came to our rescue. helped us out in 2001 and injected some funds with Jason Berenger and Nigel Tapper, played an enormous role in developing this site. From then, we now have continuous flux measurements, continuous work, monitoring of CO2, water use and energy exchange from this site. It's pretty high rainfall, 1,700 millimetres. That's a lot of rain. That's far more than the rainfall district in the VRD where we're seeing tree death. It's frequently burnt. Fire is a big factor out here. And it's also being close to Darwin's coastline has been impacted by cyclones. All essential bits of information we need to interpret the fluxes. So here's a nearly 20-year record of flux. We've got primary production in blue and latent energy, that's effectively evapotranspiration, water use. And you can see a fairly strong increase in the primary production of this system. And merging these two quantities together, we can then calculate these more useful variables: water use efficiency, how much water, how much carbon are we sequestering or potentially sequestering per unit water use. And you can see that trend is increasing quite strongly, as is the radiation use efficiency, RUE, on this right-hand axis. That's the mass of carbon per unit radiant energy absorbed. So that's quite interesting that we see this strong increase in productivity over time. So what might be driving that? Well, the only way to really attribute that is to then link with modelers. And we've been working for many years with a whole range of different modeling environments. These long-term observations become very much more powerful when you integrate them into terrestrial ecosystem models. And here we see an example on the left-hand side where we're trying to model the primary production of our site, in this case, Howard Springs. The model is this black line. That's the total ecosystem primary production. It thinks or is simulating through time. This is day of year. The observations are what we actually measured, and you can see the model did a pretty good job, although in a few parts of the seasonal cycle, it's not doing a great job. For ET, or the water use, does quite a bit better job. So the models sort of work. How can we use them? And of course, what we can do is then do some modeling experiments and see if the model would predict over that time, given the change in climatology we may have seen at the site, what would they predict would be happening? And sure enough, they would also predict a thickening. The model would predict an increase in primary production, and it's likely that that is driven by CO2 fertilization. So this is something people would have heard about. It's well reported, and it does seem to be a strong driver of that change that we're seeing. We have more CO2 in the atmosphere. We also at the site, the coastal systems, as I mentioned, are actually got a long-term wetting trend. So they're not being reduced, they're not being influenced by any sort of drought response. We're actually having adequate hydrological supply, and the net result is an increase in GPP. What about the dryer system? The NT is not Darwin. The NT is a very different kettle of fish. So here's something that's going to be probably a little confusing, but we have a time plot for each of those sites along our transect. So this x-axis is time. That's simply the number of intervals where we've got an observation from the 1st of January at 0 to the 31st of December. The y-axis is the sink strength. And a negative value is a strong sink, and a 0 is carbon neutrality, and a positive value is a source. So we're interested in what sort of dynamic will we see over time and space. This is why this network is reasonably powerful. All of that understanding we can feed into models and link to remote sensing. Ignore this little first year, that's the year of 2015. That's simply a quirk of the way we plotted this. That should start around about there. We'll ignore that for the moment, but you can see an enormous difference between years. So we had one year where we almost ended up as a net source over the entire year. So don't forget, this is the cumulative net ecosystem production. That is the net sink, be it a source or to the atmosphere or a sink to the atmosphere. It's effectively the difference between the gross primary production and the ecosystem respiration. And so I guess it's a small difference between two large fluxes, a large flux coming into the ecosystem or the landscape and that disappearing back to the atmosphere in the form of respiration. So this is the super site at Litchfield National Park. High rainfall, frequently burnt, a lot of fire. This year was the year of a very large fire and quite dry wet season, and sure enough, the net change was we lost a lot of carbon after the wet season. So here you can see the line drops down. That's the sink getting stronger and stronger till the late dry season, and then we would have had a fire event, and we had a large loss of carbon after that fire event. So we have very complex interactions of long-term change in rainfall, CO2, and fire events. Let's go to Howard Springs. That's where we've got a lot more data, a lot more wavy lines, but you can see the enormous interannual variability. Again, high rainfall system frequently burnt. So we need to unpack what's driving this interannual variability. Let's go further down the NATT. We're now at Daly River. We've dropped about 400 or 500 millimeters, and we see even more interannual variability in a far weaker sink. Notice the sink strength here, it's about -6 tons. That's an absurdly high amount given the structure of this ecosystem. But now that's come down dramatically. We're down to about 2 in the good years. And some years we actually have quite a strong source of CO2 to the atmosphere. So clearly we're building a pattern of some complexity. Now here is the dry river site, which I showed before was thickening, and you see a very distinct, it's much stronger slope. The unit is of interest again. It's still -2. It's nowhere near as strong a sink as Howard Springs, but there's perhaps slightly less interannual variability. This site is infrequently burnt. It's got a low grazing intensity. It's about 850 millimeters. And we are building up a picture of how these systems bounce around in terms of their ability to lose and gain carbon, capture carbon. We could easily have plotted respiration, water use, energy balance, all sorts of variables on here, but that would just be a little confusing. But I thought this might be useful, of interest to see this spatial and temporal complexity. Here is the Mitchell grassland that we drove through in the vehicle, where we look like we're on planet Mars. And again, you see an enormous range of possible sink dynamics this year. These 2 grey lines were the drought years, 2019. And again, the whole system was a net source. So this is a very extensive landscape. Mitchell grasslands runs right through the NT, semi-arid into Queensland. And our numbers suggest that system remained a source of CO2 to the atmosphere for some considerable time, pretty much linked to that climate change extreme. So we've got high interannual variability. We really do need to continue this monitoring. We have some resilience, of course, in the northern eucalypt systems. They are amazingly resilient to fire, but are they now showing some limited or reduced resilience if we start to move our moisture availability system? Our rainfall is changing, our evaporation's going up with temperature. We are starting to see changes that we've never seen, I've never seen before. Modelling obviously is important. It helps us unpack how systems might be going. But there was a really nice paper just published from the UNSW Climate Change ASC Centre, really good work, where they benchmarked the international models. How do they work in Australia? The answer is not great, folks. This is the cumulative productivity for Australia over 100 years, and we're getting a pretty divergent set of numbers. Here's the model trying to calculate how much carbon is hitting our soils. 10 different models, 10 answers are different. So do we need to build a model that's really much more linked into our vegetation systems? These models are all from Europe and the US. Is this the way to go in terms of understanding how our systems may bounce around? How we may lose or maintain resilience is an essential question, and modelling is a great way to try and do that, but not necessarily if we are going to have some sort of significant difference between the model performance. So that's probably more than enough for me. The most important component of infrastructure management, which is Turn's job, is the soft infrastructure and these people. So it's the people who make the networks. And here's my colleague in crime, Professor Barringer. He's sitting on a flux tower here in peat forest in Indonesia. Again, same question, what are these degraded systems doing in terms of emissions, sink, water use? And of course, in the middle, here's my long-term technical manager, Matt Northwood. Again, all of this infrastructure to produce these wonderful numbers does not happen without the likes of Barringer, Northwood, and of course, our fantastic people from Turn Central to help us with the avalanche of data that we try desperately to keep going. Matt's efforts to keep these data systems operational is heroic. But the longer these systems run, the more we can build up a picture, and that's becoming more and more important as that interannual variability, impacts of land use, impacts of climate change start to kick in, and these systems become perhaps a little more unstable, whereas traditionally you would have penciled in pretty much bomb-proof. Well, that's just not the case, and the mangrove dieback, for one, showed us that was quite an eye-opener. It was quite a shocking event. So I might leave it there.
Thanks,
So
Lindsay.
thank you very much from the Term Tropical Flux Network, and a little dedication to a dear colleague who passed away this year, suddenly, Bob Scholes, who was a giant of savanna ecology and impacts of climate change on landscapes of Africa and the planet, to be frank. So sorry if I went over time, Beryl.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And there are some questions in the Q&A that it would be really great if you could answer, because they're related to you. And I think your take-home message is that the more data, the better and more monitoring needed. I do have a question that I'd like perhaps Anna and Ian to give us a quick answer to. That so, you know, different ecosystem states may be resilient, but have different values to different people. So how do we have a conversation around the multiple perspectives of value in the context of resilience? I think this is a pretty important question. If you could give me an answer on a postage stamp with your microphones on.
You want to go, Anna?
Sure, I can go first. I don't know if I'll do a very good job of this, but I think there's still more conversations to have, but I guess with the state and transition model framing on, I guess that gives us an ability to communicate our understandings of ecosystems and at least come to a way where we can communicate a common understanding. And it's from that point that I think we can have a conversation about what different values different states have and how we might understand those multiple perspectives on those values. That's a very good response. I might hand over to Ian.
Beryl, your question actually reminds me of a very quick story I'll tell, which is I was in a Banksia woodland, which I talked about today, with Greg Norman once upon a time, and we looked out and I could see the Banksia woodland, and he turned to me and he said, "Oh my God, God's created a golf course, a natural golf course," because he saw the dunes and swales. And I went, I was like, we were looking at the same landscape, but with different eyes. And what he wanted was a golf course, and what I wanted was a Banksia woodland. So there is no way of reconciling that value difference. What we can do is we can measure and monitor and try and have enough of everything for everybody, and to try and make sure that we don't lose attributes that we can never get back. So I can tell you that you can create golf courses in places which have been cleared for agriculture, but you can't turn them back into the same functioning Banksia woodland. So it's about choices, and humans make choices all the time. The best thing we can do is have choices that are underlain by information.
I think that's a really great answers from both of you. Thank you very much for that. So Ian, I think you would like us to keep working on how it all clicks together, and in order to know more about resilience. And Anna, I think you're really, I've learned so much about the historical ecosystem dynamics as a method to look at ecological change in context of resilience, and also all your state and transition models as useful tools to communicate the dynamics. I think that's great. It's been a splendid presentation by all three of you. I really am very pleased to have had your presence today to join with everyone. And as everyone starts to leave us, I just want to draw your attention to the 4th of August webinar on climate modelling in Australia and what's the use, which is all about human health, society and environment. So I hope to see you all there. And once again, thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience and the questions that they have put there. And I hope our panelists enjoy some of the chat. So we'll be seeing you in August. Bye-bye, everyone.